Good afternoon to all of our members from the Sacred Heart Faith community and more broadly out there in Southern Oregon. Today is Wednesday, October 14th. It's in the afternoon, and it's been a while since I've had a chance to leave a spiritual message. We've been so overwhelmed with the fire situation that has taken precedence, but I want to get back to that, and I'm leaving this message at the request of several parishioners who asked me to repeat some of the words that I shared this past weekend. But just to try and make it so these messages have maybe a little longer shelf life, I'm going to start a new practice rather than labeling them as the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year A, or by the date. Maybe just give it a title. That way, I think it's a truth that certainly will pertain to us at least through this calendar year, and will give us an idea of some of the homework that we face going into 2021. The theme of this message I want to share with you is about rebuilding the church after the coronavirus shutdown has come to an end, which it inevitably will, and after all the crises of 2020 have come to a conclusion. We have some rebuilding to do, and so I want to share with you that, but I want to start with the gospel reading because it directly pertains to the message that I had to share. This message comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, and I'll just read that for you. Jesus said to the chief priests and elders, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Now, this is the message that I shared, at least in part, and it's kind of an unusual theme for my preaching, but it very much has to do with charismatic gifts and the giving of prophecy. Let me just say, though, before we get into it, the church has a clear teaching on these kinds of incidents when an individual claims to be speaking for God or relays a vision or a message that they are convinced God has given them to share with the church or with the world. We call those types of communications private revelation. And just so you know, you are not required as a Catholic in good standing to accept any private revelation. You're entitled fully to be skeptical of those claims, and in fact, you should be slow in discerning the source of those types of claims. Scripture says, "By their fruit you will know them," and usually when the church applies this wisdom, we take a lot of time to discern and see how things are going to unfold. So you can take the story with a grain of salt if you like. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, because the prophecy that I want to share with you took place in 1976, and all of the things that were described are unfolding right now in 2020. So They did come to fruition. Whether you accept the source of their prediction or not, it's entirely up to you. Uh, what we're left with, though, is a lens to interpret why they've occurred and the kind of work that will be left with us in dealing with the aftermath of these effects. So, uh, let me just start by saying that this story was relayed to me from our clergy convocation this year. Normally, I shared with people on Sunday, normally canon law prescribes that clergy get together fraternally as a group, normally twice a year. One is through a fraternal retreat where we generally focus on the spiritual needs of the clergy, that idea that you cannot give what you don't yourself possess, and that we have to tend to our own spiritual life, as well as encouraging others to grow. We're priests for you, but we're Christians with you, and we experience the same kind of struggles you do. Um, so we want to guard that we don't become the blind leading the blind, and therefore canon law wisely requires that we participate in an annual retreat. But we also have what we call a convocation, and for lack of a better term, we would say this is a business meeting. This might normally be dealing with new forms of paperwork required for insurance, or for safety protocols for the use of facilities, or a new procedure in marriage annulments, or liturgical norms being changed in our local diocese, or things of that nature. So it's generally administrative and policy discussion, that kind of thing. And also governance is when we elect new officers. This year, however, our convocation was entirely different. First of all, it was by Zoom, so because of coronavirus, we're not able to physically gather. But secondly, I think the Archbishop wisely discerned as our shepherd that because of the challenges of this year, we're in greater need of spiritual support than ever. We're all facing financial distress as parishes. We're all having stewardship challenges because many of our parishioners have lost their employment, or their businesses are struggling. Our schools are distressed because we're not able to do direct instruction, and so we've all had drops in enrollment. We have the coronavirus restrictions. In the north, they're dealing with riots and those kinds of civil unrest. Here in the south, we got hit by wildfires that have brought immense damage. So it just seems like it's a pile on of one thing after another. And for all these reasons, the guest that was chosen for our convocation probably in normal years would be more suited for our retreat. But nevertheless, it was arranged, and it was a great blessing to me. His name was Dr. Ralph Martin, based out of Michigan. And he shared with us in part a bit of his friendship with a priest named Father Michael Scanlon. If you are familiar with Steubenville University, you know today it's known as one of the strongest, lighthouses of the Catholic faith, really, in the country today. I think it's a close call between Steubenville and Life Teen, who perhaps produces more priests for the Catholic Church these days. I'm certain that Steubenville produces more youth ministers than any other source in the United States. And over the years, with people like Dr. Bergsma and Dr. Scott Hahn, they have become kind of the mecca of biblical scholarship as well. So it's become a central powerhouse of Catholic thought, but it wasn't always the case. Some years back, our guest speaker mentioned that Steubenville was actually listed by none other than Playboy magazine as one of the top 10 party schools in the United States. And you can imagine what kind of activities would go along with that description, that title. Certainly, it was not an evangelizing force of the faith, and reform was needed. So they brought in this Franciscan priest from New York, Father Michael Scanlon. He was a man of great vision, and he was a charismatic figure, featured a lot of times on EWTN, and in a lot of ways I compare him to Mother Angelica, actually, when she shares the story of how God nudged her into starting a TV network. they were both charismatic figures in both senses of the word. They have very compelling personalities. They're natural leaders. They inspire people, but also I mean in the St. Paul sense of the word when he writes to the Corinthians. They had charismatic gifts, and Father Michael Scanlon had also an abundance of courage. When he came in, he cut ties with outside sources of influence, outside funding, government funding, certain grants, the sports programs. He just said, I have to cut all of that, those things that are pulling us away from our mission, and I'm going to lean on Christ alone. And while this happened, I think he came under great attack. People thought he was a madman. People thought he was going to destroy the university. They didn't understand the approach he was taking. It seemed counterintuitive to business-like people. But history has shown he was correct in his assessment of what needed to be done. And while many other Catholic high schools and Catholic universities across the country have lost their way and really lost their mission, Steubenville is one of those short list of success stories that have actually gotten much stronger. That's just a little vignette, a little anecdotal tale to give you a sense of this guy's character. Well, this same Father Michael Scanlon, we were told, shared a prophecy that he believed he received from God back in 1976 during the bicentennial of our nation. This, many of you perhaps can't remember, but it was, we're celebrating the 200th year of the birth of our nation. Patriotism was strong in the air, nostalgia, reflecting on our founding fathers, our history with pride. Many people having the sense of being blessed that we're part of the greatest nation on earth. Things were doing well, generally speaking, in society. But he shared, I don't know in what context or how large of a group of people he shared this with initially, but he shared that God revealed to him a different time in the future, a time of testing. And this time would be marked by 4 major crises. And as I said in the beginning of this talk, all of which have been manifested in 2020. The first one is he described an economic collapse that would take place. We've seen that. Some news agencies report that 1 in 5 businesses have closed now because of the coronavirus shutdowns in many states, and they will not be coming back. Families who've been bankrupted, who had maybe some savings to ride them through rough patches, but not 8 or 10 months of extended economic shutdown where government restrictions were the most harsh. They just could not ride out the storm, and so they lost businesses. Many people were laid off work or furloughed or had their income cut. Hard times many people have experienced economically because of this pandemic and policy attempts to contain the pandemic. That was the first mark. The second mark he described was a kind of civil unrest and lawlessness. Well, we see that in major cities all over the country, where cries of defunding the police are made, where riots are allowed to continue without limit, seemingly. Our own state has probably the worst example in the United States, Portland, where the local mayor has removed police ability to really arrest people properly or contain the situation, where the local district attorney has committed to not pressing charges to anyone who's been involved in riots. And so if someone is arrested, they seem to be released back into the streets the same day or the next day, and more mayhem ensues. The third mark had to do with an attack on our history, on our nostalgia. And you can see that on display as academic agendas have tried to rewrite our history, essentially, I would say, in a way that tries to form our young people to be ashamed of our nation, to not be proud of it, to see it as kind of dark and evil. And you see it in efforts of the mobs to destroy various historical statues and landmarks. And the last piece, he said, was the closing of churches. And that apparently was the most shocking to him, to imagine, the original pilgrims who came here came above all else for religious liberty. To try and imagine a situation in the United States where that liberty might be challenged or attacked was kind of beyond the pale. And at any rate, all four of these things form a perfect attack. And I would say it's part of spiritual warfare. It's evil. All of them attack the church in some way. The economic crisis, for instance, the bottom line is it has affected stewardship programs in parishes everywhere. Some small churches have closed. They just economically can't stay open. Many parishes have had to lay off staff. And when you reduce the staff and you reduce your resources, your ability to respond with ministry and at times of need is diminished. No matter how hard you work, no matter how much you try to overcome, those restrict us and limit us. Catholic education is without a doubt being threatened because when times are tough, private school tuition, maybe that's a thing families have to cut back from. And so I heard as of last month, something like 132 Catholic schools that have shut down since March across the country, and more. It will come in waves, month by month, the longer this shutdown is extended. We're experiencing that here locally with Sacred Heart. We're losing families to homeschooling. We're losing families to free options of education. So we're having to dig into our emergency savings just to keep everything operational. When you talk about a lawlessness, it's actually at its heart, it's an attack against authority. Our church is hierarchical in nature. It's authoritarian. We have the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, the Pope and the bishops in union with him. That has come under attack, and sometimes you see that manifested. There have been churches vandalized or burned. There have been Catholic statues and symbols destroyed. The third part, that attack against our history, our nostalgia, that's the Catholic Church in a nutshell. We have sacred tradition. We're a historical church. We celebrate Christian history. All of that is under attack. And finally, with the attendance restrictions, with church services, literally churches were shut down. We still have parts of Oregon where only 25 people or less are allowed to attend Mass. Here in our county, we can now have 100 people in the church, and on a second facility location, we can accommodate an additional 100. But that's about 40% of what our normal attendance would be per Mass. So many people are not able to join. They're either assessing that they're an at-risk medical group and they don't want to take that risk of gathering with large crowds, or the restrictions don't allow people to come and attend. What is the final analysis of this, and what does this have to do with the gospel that I read to you? Well, Archbishop Sample shared with us a concern that he has, and it's one that I've been pondering in my own heart. When all this is done, when all this shutdown is over, what will the church actually look like? You all know here locally that Archbishop Sample has extended a dispensation for people not to have to attend Mass on the Sabbath, though you're not dispensed from keeping the Sabbath holy, I should mention. But attendance now no longer comes with the weight of committing sin if you're not able to do that. But what I've noticed, and what other priests have noticed, and we've shared with each other, is it's generally not the at-risk people who are taking advantage of this dispensation. It's actually people my age and even younger who simply say that's the easier way out. It's an easier pathway. I think of that, and I also think of that kind of general knowledge that you may have heard said a time or two, that it takes about 30 days to establish a new habit. We have been going since March, about 8 months with this new habit that is very well entrenched by now, to the point where some people, I think, will not be returning to church when all this is done. They have found other things to do on their Sundays, and they've fallen out of the habit of attending. And to be very frank with you, some of them were already quite lukewarm or on the fence with their faith anyway. All it took was one more straw to break the camel's back. So it is without a doubt a fact, I think, that our church in the post-COVID-19 era will be a smaller church. It was also brought up, by the way, that even with that smaller attendance, we need to avoid falling into a further error, and this is something Dr. Ralph Martin brought up quite strongly. He said, the measure of our success or our fruitfulness should not be measured by how many heads we can count, how many people are sitting in the pews. It should be on how many out there are disciples. There are a lot of people who attend Mass begrudgingly. They're drug along with their family, but they themselves are not yet disciples. I say not yet because I hold out in hope. But discipleship is kind of a high bar. It means Christ is at the center of your life. Christ guides every decision you make. He's the top of the pyramid. He's your number one priority. Many people are not that. They come to church for fire insurance, but they don't really fully commit to that relationship with Christ. Many people tell themselves, before I die, one day I'll get there. I intend to get there, but just not yet. I don't really want to be too holy at this point in my life. So it's kind of like trying to keep one foot in each camp and stay in that neutral zone without fully committing. Those people, if you were of that mindset, many of them are the ones who will not be back. How this pertains to the gospel is those of us who remain, we are those servants whom the master is sending out to invite people to the wedding feast. The wedding feast is the Mass. The master is God. And he commands us as disciples to go out and invite people to come back, to come. But notice the response they get, depending on the various translations you read. Some people ignore the invitation. They're just passive aggressive, or they're unmoved. They have no inertia. They can't be invited back. Their heart has grown so cold, they just can't be inspired to come. Some people, it said, would rather tend to work. You know, those workaholics out there who now see it as 7 days to be able to work. Some people, it says some of the farmers went out to purchase oxen or take a look at some cattle or whatever for their farm. Essentially, they went shopping. How many people do that? They just treat Sunday as a free day to go shop. Some people, you know, whatever, you fill in the blank. What is the X factor? People who turn to their hobbies, people who just want to sleep in, people who have checked out completely. And by the way, there's that last figure too who does show up, but he's not properly dressed. That has always been a metaphor in our church for those who need to go to confession first. We've been so long away and have, you know, we've committed so many sins in the absence of God's grace that the first thing we need to do is pull some weeds. We need to tend to our spiritual health as we return to the sacraments. But that is the picture of the church in 2021. We will be smaller, but hopefully mightier, and we're in need of disciples more than we are in need of head count. We have to re-engage in a kind of new evangelization. And the way that Dr. Ralph Martin defines that new evangelization, by the way, he said, there's not a new Jesus. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. There's not a new teaching from Jesus. It's eternal truth that we are talking about. But there are two things in which we can speak of this evangelization as kind of new. The first one he maintains is that in the past, evangelization was either accomplished by osmosis, because we were in, for the most part, a pretty strong Judeo-Christian culture, which is not true today. Nearly 40% of people do not believe in God today. Or secondly, that it was the work of the clergy. People saw it as the role of priests and religious to evangelize. That has changed, for sure. The bulk of the work has to fall on the shoulders of the laity. So there are new agents to this new evangelization. The second piece that is also true is, I challenge you to go out and find anyone in the United States who's never heard of Jesus Christ. They've heard the stories. They're familiar with the tales. It's not a matter of ignorance that is keeping them away. It's that they are not moved by it. They've heard, but it has not moved their heart. It's not inspired them. And I would argue that probably part of the reason is they've not seen enough examples of faith in action. They've not seen the testimony of people's lives transformed. They've not heard the testimony from people of how Jesus has changed our lives. So as we go out and invite people to the wedding feast, I think we need to share our testimony. And before we can do that, we need to make sure our faith is strong, that we're up to the task. Archbishop Sample said these striking words that stuck in my heart and caused me to bring that to prayer for a number of days afterward. He said, I maintain that we are not ready for this work. We're not ready. We need to amp up our game before we can engage in that work. He shared with us a little bit of his own spiritual life, of adding fasting days on Tuesday for all of you and on Friday for the clergy, and how he has tried to add an additional holy hour to his days. And he urged us to take up the challenge and to try and challenge our staff. So I'm trying to do that. I'm adding those fasting efforts. I'm trying to work on that prayer life piece. We're trying to do this as a staff. Some of the staff have taken this challenge up with me. We're planning a retreat for our staff coming soon here in the fall, just to really take that challenge seriously, that invitation to get ready for the work to come. That is what I urge you. If you're listening to this message attentively, it means you're one of the servants who still have a foot in the church. We need you. You have to go out and invite people to come back. We have to rebuild the church after all this crisis is done. And it leads me to a thing I want to close with. Going back full circle back to Father Michael Scanlon, what Dr. Ralph Martin mentioned about him. After these 4 crises were revealed to him, this economic collapse, the lawlessness, the attack on our history, the closing of churches, in some ways he asked God, apparently, why will you let this happen? Why is this going to unfold? What good can come of it? And apparently God revealed to him, these are the false idols that you've been leaning on up to now, and I need to take those away from you so that you can learn once again to lean fully on me, on my strength. It's an invitation, if we have the eyes to see it, to deepen our faith. For people who have no faith, crisis crushes them. It breaks them. For people of faith, it can deepen our relationship. It can actually guide us through the mystery of cross to a deeper holiness. That is what 2020 is and can be, if we have the grace and the faith to see it as such, to take advantage of these tests to make sure that we're leaning on the rock of Jesus Christ. I wish you all the best in that endeavor. I hope you'll join me in this challenge of taking these last months of this year of crisis and really allowing it to work on our hearts and transform us so that we can be ready for the very intense and hard work of discipleship and evangelization in 2021. God bless you.